The Founder of Demonic Cultivation. An English translation by ㅤㅤㅤㅤ. Read by Luna Minerva. Chapter 21. Sunshine, Part 4. The din emanated from everywhere and all directions. Forward, backward, over their heads, underneath their feet, like an ocean of whispers, buzzing, trembling, giggling, laughing. Some voices were male, some female, some old, some young, some soft, some loud. Wei Wuxian could almost pick out fragmentary phrases, but then, in the twinkling of an eye, they were gone, the exact words slipping through his fingers. It was entirely too noisy. One of Wei Wuxian's hands pressed down on his temple, while the other reached into his Qiangquan pouch and, with great effort, wrapped itself around an evil wind compass. The compass's needle shook and quivered as it spun a couple of times around. Then it began revolving faster and faster, rapidly becoming wild and frenzied. Last time on Dafan Mountain, the compass hadn't been able to find a target to point towards, which had been quite strange. But this time, even more inexplicably, it spun on its own, refusing to rest. The ominous shadow over Wei Wuxian's heart grew darker and darker. He raised his voice and shouted, "Jinli!" He and Lan Wangji had already walked around the stone fortress for quite some time, glimpsing neither hide nor hair of another living human. After yelling a few times, Wei Wuxian still heard no reply. The rooms they had checked first were all empty and bare. However, as they ventured into the deepest part of the abyss, they suddenly happened upon a chamber with a pitch-black coffin lying in its center. The coffin's presence was startling and very unexpected, but its wood was a uniform deep black, and it was exquisitely carved. As soon as Wei Wuxian laid eyes on it, he felt a particularly fond affection for it. Unable to stop himself from patting the thing, he discovered the wood to be fine and sturdy, and through it, the sound of his gesture echoed heavy and true. Voice full of approval, he said, "Good coffin." Lan Wangji and Wei Wuxian stood on either side of it. Their gazes met, and they simultaneously extended their hands and lifted the lid. As soon as it opened, the clamor surrounding them grew exponentially, the sudden tide drowning Wei Wuxian's ears. It was as though, prior to this, countless eyes had been spying on them, eyes whose owners had been clandestinely noting and discussing their every word and action. As soon as they saw that he and Lan Wangji were about to open the coffin, their agitation immediately surged. Wei Wuxian had thought through dozens of possibilities. He had already prepared for a putrid stench to assault his nose, or vicious claws to reach out and seize him, or liquid poison to shoot at his face, or toxic gas to be dispersed in all directions, or a vengeful spirit to strike out at him, that sort of thing. Of course, his greatest wish was to find Jinling, but, as it turned out, he discovered nothing. There was nothing to discover. The coffin was empty. Wei Wuxian had not expected this, and was somewhat disappointed not to find Jinling trapped inside. Lan Wangji moved closer to him, and Bichen unsheathed itself a few centimeters, glowing brightly with cold light, illuminating the bottom of the coffin. Only then did Wei Wuxian discover that the coffin was not, in fact, empty. Rather, the thing inside was much smaller than the body that he had expected, and was hidden in the deepest part of the coffin's bowels. Inside the coffin lay a long saber. This saber had no sheath, and its hilt appeared forged out of gold. Though the grip appeared hefty, its blade was long and thin, the edge as brilliant as fresh snow. The layer of red cloth which the weapon lay atop made the reflected light bleed crimson, shrouding the saber in a thick, murderous aura. Someone had placed a saber inside this coffin, instead of a corpse. There was nothing that wasn't strange about the stone fortress on Xinglu Ridge, and every step further seemed to reveal yet more oddities. The two men closed the coffin and continued further inside, discovering several more rooms containing the same kind of coffin. The coffin's ages were different, and they were built with wood of varying textures, but each contained another long saber. But by the time they reached the final room, they still hadn't seen a single sign or shadow of Jinling. Upon closing the final coffin, Wei Wuxian found his frantic heart difficult to quiet. Lan Wangji saw his companion's knitted brows and his wordless mouth, and muttered to himself briefly, then laid his guqin atop the coffin lid. He lifted his hands, and a string of notes flowed from his fingertips. He only played for a few short moments before his right hand left the top of his instrument and he began scrutinizing the still vibrating strings. Then a string shook. The guqin had plucked a note by itself. "Soul Inquiry?" Wei Wuxian asked. Soul Inquiry was a famous song composed by one of the Guosulan clan's ancestors. It was different from soul evocation and was typically used when the identity of a deceased person was unknown and no medium was available. The musician used the notes of a qin to ask questions of the spirit of the deceased. Their answers would be transformed into musical notes and played back on the strings. Since the strings had moved by themselves, that meant Lan Wangji had already contacted one of the dead spirits of the fortress. Next, he would question the spirit using the language of the qin, and the spirit would reply. The qin language was a secret technique known only by members of the Guosulan clan. Though Wei Wuxian had dabbled in quite a vast array of things, there were always places a person could not reach, so he was unable to decipher any of the sounds. Quietly he said, "Han Guangjun, help me ask what this place is, what it's used for, and who built it." Lan Wangji was a master of the qin language. He did not require any time to think before his steady and reliable hand plucked a couple of pure, clear notes. After a moment, his guqin strings sounded a couple more times on their own. Wei Wuxian asked hurriedly, "What did it say?" "I do not know," Lan Wangji said. "Huh?" Nonchalantly, Lan Wangji repeated, "It said I do not know." Wei Wuxian looked at him, suddenly remembering how, many years ago, they had had a similar conversation about Sui Bian. He rubbed his nose, speechless. "Nanzhan's grown up too much. He's even learned how to make me choke." As the first question was unsuccessful, Lan Wangji played another. The guqin strings answered again with the same two. As before, Wei Wuxian could tell that the answer was "I don't know" again, so he said, "What did you ask it this time?" "Its cause of death." "If it was murdered unawares, it's very possible it doesn't know the cause of its own death. How about you ask whether it knows who killed it?" Lan Wangji raised his hand and plucked the string. But yet again, the reply was the same two. "I don't know." An imprisoned, deceased soul who didn't know where it was, why it died, or who had killed it. This was the first time Wei Wuxian had encountered such an ignorant member of the dead. He turned his mind around and tried to approach the issue from a different direction. "Let's ask something else. Ask it whether it's male or female. It should at least know that." Lan Wangji played as requested. After he lifted his hand, a powerful ring echoed from another string. He translated, "Male." So he knows something after all. Now ask him whether a 15 or 16-year-old boy came here. The answer was, "Yes." "Then where is he now?" Wei Wuxian asked again. The guqin paused for a moment, then answered. Hurriedly, Wei Wuxian said, "What did he say?" Lan Wangji's expression was focused and intense.
"He said, right here."
Wei Wuxian went mute. Here had to refer to the stone fortress, but they had searched the whole place without seeing Jingling. "He can't lie, right?" Wei Wuxian asked.
"I am here. He cannot,"
Lan Wangji said. Indeed, since Han Guangjun was asking the questions and controlling the exchange, the spirit would naturally be unable to lie and could only answer sincerely. Wei Wuxian began turning the whole room upside down and inside out, probing for some secret passageway or mechanism he had overlooked. Meanwhile, Lan Wangji thought for a moment, then played a couple more phrases. After receiving the answer, his expression changed slightly. Seeing this, Wei Wuxian hastily said, "What did you ask now?"
"The spirit's age, and where he hails from,"
Lan Wangji said. These two questions were used to determine the identity of an unknown spirit. In his heart, Wei Wuxian knew that Lan Wangji must have received a strange answer. "And?"
15 years of age, from Lanling."
Wei Wuxian's expression abruptly changed. The spirit that Soul Inquiry had summoned was Jinling? Rapidly, he directed all his energy to listening extremely carefully to the din, blanketing the heavens and drowning the earth. Though Jinling's cries were quiet and nearly lost in the noise, Wei Wuxian did seem to be able to hear them, if only indistinctly. Lan Wangji continued to ask questions. Knowing that he could only be asking about Jinling's exact position, Wei Wuxian glued his eyes to the guqing strings, waiting for Jinling's response. This time the reply was relatively long. After Lan Wangji finished listening to it, he said to Wei Wuxian,
"From your current position, face southwest, then listen to the strings. For every note, move forward 1 step. Once the music stops, I will be right in front of you."
Without saying a word, Wei Wuxian turned and faced southwest. From behind him, 7 notes played, so he walked forward 7 steps. However, the space in front of him was entirely empty. The sound of the guqing continued, but the space between each note was longer and longer. Wei Wuxian walked slower and slower too. Another step, another couple of steps, 3 more steps. Once he took the last of these 6 steps, the qin finally fell silent and sounded no more. However, there was only a wall in front of him. This wall was also made of ash-gray stone bricks, each squeezed tightly against its neighbors, not a gap in sight. Wei Wuxian turned around. "He's in the wall?" Bi Chen left its scabbard. 4 rays of blue light swept past, and the blade slashed a neat Qing character into the wall. Both Lan Wangji and Wei Wuxian rushed forward to tear down the brick, clearing many ash-gray stones and exposing an enormous slab of black earth. The fortress walls turned out to have 2 layers, with soil filling the space between the 2 solid layers of rock. Using his bare hands, Wei Wuxian dug out a large chunk of earth. In the middle of the dark soil was a human face, whose eyes were screwed tightly shut. It was the missing Jinling. Jinling's face hadn't been buried inside the dirt, so immediately after he was exposed to the open air, breath abruptly filled his lungs. Soon he was hacking and gasping wildly. Upon seeing that the boy was still alive, Wei Wuxian was finally able to relax. Jinling's life must have been hanging by a thread, or else he wouldn't have been pulled into soul inquiry's questioning, as it wouldn't have been able to seize his soul were it not on the verge of leaving his body. Thank goodness the time he had spent buried inside the wall wasn't long. If he had been left much longer, he would have suffocated and passed away. Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji hastily dug him out of the wall, but just as mud comes along when one pulls radishes out from the soil, when Jinling's upper body was freed from the earth, the sword on his back dragged something to the surface with it. An eerie, white arm bone. Lan Wangji laid Jinling flat on the ground and checked his pulse, while Wei Wuxian lifted Bi-Chen's scabbard and skillfully poked and dug around the arm bone still stuck in the earth. Not long after, a whole skeleton appeared before him. Just like Jinling, this skeleton had been buried inside the wall in standing position. The bones were stark white, and against the black soil the contrast was so glaring that it stung the eyes. Wei Wuxian dug around in the dirt some more, removed a few more bricks, and pushed around the soil. Sure enough, he discovered a second skeleton nearby. This one's flesh had not completely rotted away. Long, disheveled raven hair spilled from atop its skull, and its half-disintegrated clothing was still a washed-out red. Wei Wuxian could tell that the skeleton belonged to a woman, and unlike the first, she was bent over at the waist. The explanation for her posture was next to her leg. A third set of bones squatted beside it. Wei Wuxian stopped digging. He backed away a few steps, and the clamor in his ears surged upward like an unbridled tide. Now he had nearly confirmed it. All the thick walls of the entire fortress were filled with human remains. Above his head, below his feet, north and south, east and west, standing, sitting, squatting, lying down. Exactly what kind of place was this?